Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for October 21st, 2022. This has been an incredibly eventful week, and I've received many questions from people who are trying to make sense of things, trying to figure out what can be done. How do you know what to do? How do you know what's true? Some hostile questions, but that's okay. I can handle it. And I want to go through a number of these questions to try to help people make sense of what's going on. But the most important thing is for you to think, to be engaged in a critical analysis of what you actually know and how you know it. Because there's so much propaganda. We're in the midst of a propaganda war. And the Anglo-American forces have been working on this since the Second World War. This was a major part of the post-war development, the cultural warfare, how to shape national consensus. And if you can't shape it, how do you divide countries so that you have what we now know as identity politics to keep people who actually have common interests, how to keep them apart and divide them. So the most important thing is not to accept what I'm saying or what we post on the LaRouche Organization website, but to think through the concepts. Become a philosopher in the sense that you want to know where your ideas come from, as opposed to what should I think to be popular. Now, let's start with one that I think is quite important. What can be done? What can be done about this situation? Well, yesterday I posted a discussion between Diane Sayre and Scott Ritter, which many of you commented on and appreciated a great deal. Diane Sayre is the LaRouche independent candidate running for the U.S. Senate in New York against Chuck Schumer. And Scott Ritter, of course, is a famous anti-war activist, or I should say more correctly, someone who is committed to the idea of truth, and who was a whistleblower during the Iraq War and has continued to be outspoken to the extent that he's been put on the same target list from the Ukrainian Center for Combating Disinformation that Diane Sayre, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, and myself are on. Now, many of you appreciated that. Today I'm going to post a link to another discussion, this one a dialogue between Diane Sayre and one of her opponents in the upcoming Senate election, the Republican candidate. Chuck Schumer, of course, did not show up. Now, if you listen to this discussion from Diane, you'll see why Schumer didn't want to show up. Schumer is an outspoken supporter of all that is bad about the present direction of U.S. NATO policy. He doesn't want to be challenged on that. He doesn't want to be challenged on his blank check support for Joe Biden, for the Build Back Better, for all the other crazy policies coming out of the Democratic Party. But also he's very close to most of the war hawk Republicans. There's not much difference on the war between Schumer and Mitch McConnell. So I think if you listen to this discussion, especially listen to what Diane has to say, it will give you some real insights. And also the discussion between her and Pinion, the Republican candidate in the race. Remember, there are only three candidates. There's Schumer, Pinion, and Diane Sayre. So go to the link at the bottom of the description page and listen to it and think about it. And think about what you could do to have an effect in this election. And also get involved in whatever elections are going on in your area. Find a candidate who's not crazy, and do something to not just support them, but to shape the way the people are thinking about the election. Now let's take up a couple of the questions. What the hell is going on in the United Kingdom? Why did the Bank of England intervene in the battle in London, and so on? Let's look at it from the top rather than the specifics, because it's clear that the British comedic class, that is the people who are commenting on this crisis, are having a ball because there's so much material there. But what's behind it? You know, the collapse of the Truss government, the fact that Truss became a punching bag, but she was actually an incompetent candidate to start with. She was a leading promoter of the war in Ukraine, a leading promoter of the most extreme form of neoliberal economics, And it was so extreme that even the Bank of England, which generally supports the approach that Xi and Kwarteng were taking, intervened in coming out and attacking her and essentially working with people in the Tory party to bring her down. The backdrop to this is the Ukraine war, Brexit, the relationship with Europe, and especially the relationship with the United States. And don't forget that there was an emergency trip by the British Defense Minister, who's one of the potential candidates for Prime Minister, Ben Wallace, to Washington yesterday or 2 days ago to consult with Lloyd Austin, the Defense Secretary, and Sullivan, the National Security Advisor. And he's tight-lipped about what they said. All we know is that they said that they couldn't talk over the phone. It was so confidential. So we don't know exactly what they said, but here's the bigger point. President Putin said in several addresses recently that the world is at a point of global transformation, a move from one system which is collapsing to another system. What he said is that the collapsing system cannot be saved. This is something that we've been saying for a long time, what Lyndon LaRouche identified back in the 1990s, but especially after 2008. You can't save a system which depends on financial speculation to produce so-called wealth, because printing paper and placing values on paper and betting on paper is not wealth. Wealth is physical good production. It's the transformation of nature into things that increase the standard of living for a growing number of people. That's what real wealth is, value added. And questions such as tax cuts, the volume of money flowing through the system, those are essentially there for quants and for statisticians and for billionaires who can grab as much of the financial paper as they can, but it's not real wealth. It may give them access to goods, but as someone said recently, you cannot print energy and food. You can print paper, but what good is the paper if you have no energy and food and security? So we're seeing what Putin described as a transformation. There's a new system that's on the verge of being set up based on physical economy. This is the expertise of Lyndon LaRouche. And so what we're seeing in the United Kingdom is what happens periodically, which is that the British elite, who are totally committed to a certain policy, can jump to a different policy very quickly and use their control over the media and psychological warfare to bring the population around behind them. And that's what it looks like we're seeing right now. Remember what the foreign minister of Britain in the 19th century said, Lord Palmerston. He said, Britain has no permanent friends, only permanent interests. Whose interests are they? The interests of the elite, the City of London, the House of Lords, the people who actually run the island and run the Commonwealth and previously ran the empire. And at this point, to some extent, run the thinking of the establishment in the United States, because it's British thinking, whether it's the London School of Economics or Cambridge or Oxford or Chatham House or the think tanks such as the Atlantic Council, the CFR. They take their lead from the British. And right now, the British are watching a system crumble, their credibility going out the window. And they're in a desperate move to try and figure out whether or not they can co-opt the new system that's emerging, or whether they should be committed to a war to destroy Russia and China. And I think that's really what's going on behind the scenes. And it's a very dangerous moment. And it's one where there are very few voices speaking out with any credibility about how to get out of this situation. Now, there's a question to me, why do you dislike Ukrainians? My point on Ukraine is that the policy that's been adopted by the Ukrainian president, under pressure from NATO, remember, he was prepared to sign an agreement at the end of March, a ceasefire, a negotiated settlement. And Boris Johnson flew into Kiev and told him not to do it. NATO insisted, we'll give you a blank check on weapons, we'll pay for your government, but you have to keep fighting Russia. And what's the cost of fighting Russia? Well, for the West, it's a lot of money and a lot of ammunition. For Ukraine, it's lives. Ukrainians are being sacrificed in a war that will not solve the problems for Ukraine. Ukraine needs security guarantees. Ukraine is in a position geographically where it can play a leading role in the integration of Western Europe and the Eurasian continent, the Eurasian landmass. The integration going on in Asia was part of what the conception of it was, that it would be brought into Europe as a trading relationship. And this is the thinking of the industrialists in Germany and France and Italy, and has been for a long time. The British don't want that. And so they're using the people of Ukraine as cannon fodder. And that's to say that is not to demean the people of Ukraine. I want them out of the war. And the way to get out of the war is to realize that the war didn't start in February 2022. It started with the February coup in 2014, which was funded and organized by the West to use Ukraine against Russia. Remember, there was a coup against an elected government, a democratically elected government in Ukraine, the Yanukovych government. And then the Ukrainian armed forces conducted warfare, shelling into the Donbass. And this went on for 8 years without much of a peep from the West. There was an agreement signed in 2015, the Minsk II agreement, that should have ended that. It didn't. So for those people who say that it's all Putin's fault, it was unprovoked, study your history. At least go back to 2014, if not to 1990, and realize there's been a concerted effort from Western establishment figures to destroy Russia. And what's behind this? Russia will not accept the idea that there's only one economic model that's acceptable. Neither will China. And the Great Reset starts from the standpoint that only the model of the Western so-called capitalist system, the free market system, that's the only one that's acceptable. And if you don't accept it, you're an autocracy, and therefore a target for NATO. And that's what this issue is all about. And the people of Ukraine are hapless victims in the sense of this. They're not going to become a great power. But they have a just cause of security guarantees, as do the Russians. And this is what's been rejected by the Western powers. Now, a part of the result of this is the sacrifice now of people in Western Europe, the loss of energy, of electricity, the inflation. As Liz Truss did with her resignation speech yesterday, she tried to blame it all on Putin. Well, Putin didn't make her stupid. Putin didn't screw up the British economy. It was done by the City of London, by the Tory party, done by the economists. And to blame it on Putin is just looking for a scapegoat. The reality is that these wars, going back to the NATO wars in Serbia, against Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, have a purpose, which is to crush any nation which asserts its sovereignty. And so that's what the fight is against the globalist New World Order. Now, in Europe, we're beginning to see a rebellion against it. We see it in Germany. We see it on the streets of France. Over 100,000 people were out earlier this week. In the Czech Republic, in Belgium, in Italy. And the question many people are asking is, why not in the United States? Well, we're seeing certain things happen. The discrediting of the so-called loyal progressive opposition like AOC and the Squad. The two young LaRouche organizers completely ripped the cover off them as frauds when they claim to be anti-war when they're funding the war in Ukraine. So the potential is there to build a movement in the United States which is a bigger movement than most people are thinking about. Most people are thinking we have to fight against the Democrats. It's not the Democrats. The same people who run Biden control Mitch McConnell and control most of the Republicans in Congress, which is why there was a unanimous vote to declare Russia a terrorist state in the US Senate, because they have the same masters, the same paymasters. So if you want to have demonstrations in the United States, you have to have people who address the real issue. And the real issue is the fight against the war hawks, who are an arm of the neoliberal economic establishment, the Federal Reserve, Wall Street, the City of London. That's the enemy of mankind. The American founding fathers knew it. That's why we made a revolution against them. Now, there's also a question, what's going on with the United States and the Saudis? Well, the Saudis rejected Biden's begging of them to increase oil production. They know that's not going to solve the problem. They're actually producing as near capacity oil, but they're also looking at the strategic reality. And the reality is that the U.S. policy for Saudi Arabia has been to have the Saudis fund terrorists that the U.S. were using for their geopolitical purposes. Maybe the Saudis are wising up. Maybe they're prepared to break with that and look as part of the global South at what could be done with the petrodollars that they have to build up nations instead of funding the Western war machine. So this is part of the great transformation that's underway right now that Putin was talking about. But again, before Putin said this is not a Putin talking point. This is a Lyndon LaRouche talking point. LaRouche identified 50 years ago the need to break with this neoliberal imperial policy from the City of London and its allies in Washington and Wall Street. And that's what this fight is about. So I would encourage you to go to the description section, click on the link of the discussion between Diane Sayre and the Republican Senate candidate Pinion, and listen to what Diane is saying about how to win this fight. And also listen to the anger of the media, of the interviewer, who is somewhat astounded that Diane will say things that go outside of the accepted narrative. Well, that's the courage that's needed if we're going to win this battle. Thank you for joining me. Share this video. Get people working with the LaRouche Organization and the Schiller Institute so we can create a new security and financial architecture that will serve the interests of every single person on this planet, rather than the handful of billionaires who think they can control the policies of nations and governments.